3:30 in the afternoon, February 2018, on the road that runs south out of Corinna in Tasmania's west. A couple from Western Australia have just crossed the Pieman River on the barge and are driving into some of the least traveled country in Australia. An animal walks slowly out onto the road in front of them. They get a clear view of it for 12 to 15 seconds, and what they describe afterwards is very specific. A stiff, firm tail, thick at the base, not curled, not carried like a dog's. Stripes running down its back, roughly the size of a large kelpie. They filed a report with the Tasmanian government. In it, they stated they were 100% certain of what they had seen. The animal they described has been officially extinct since 1936. And here is the part almost nobody knows. That report is not folklore, and it is not a rumor on a forum. It sits in a government file, logged and dated by the Department of Primary Industries, Parks, Water and Environment, released to the public under Right to Information Law. It is one of 8 the department recorded in a 3-year window. The state's west is the hotspot. There are reports from the Huon, from Waratah, from Mount Roland, from King William Saddle, from the Midlands, from Launceston. The department's own position on all of them is one sentence. There is no evidence to confirm the thylacine still exists. They keep logging them anyway. Now hold that against what is happening 400 kilometers away in a laboratory in Melbourne and 11,000 kilometers away in Dallas, Texas. Because at the same time, the Tasmanian government is filing sighting reports on an animal it says does not exist. A company valued at over $10 billion is spending a fortune trying to build one from scratch. This is a story about 2 ways of getting the same animal back. One of them happens in a forest. The other happens under fluorescent light, in a building with a security badge on the door. And almost nobody has asked the obvious question about what happens if both of them work. Start with how we lost it, because that part is not in dispute. The thylacine was not a tiger, and it was not a wolf. It was a marsupial, a striped predator with the skull of a wolf and a pouch that opened toward its tail, and a jaw that hinged to something near 80 degrees, wider than any other mammal on the continent. Nothing else on Earth was built like it, and we killed it deliberately. From 1888, the Tasmanian government paid a bounty on it, £1 for an adult, 10 shillings for a juvenile. By the time the scheme ended in 1909, 2,184 bounties had been paid out, and the real number killed was certainly higher because plenty of hunters never bothered to claim. The charge was that it killed sheep. In 2011, a researcher at the University of New South Wales ran 3-dimensional models of the thylacine skull to simulate bite force under load, and found the jaw came under extreme stress against any struggling prey of real size. The animal was physically restricted to prey no larger than a possum, a predator the size of a large dog, built to take rabbits. Tasmania exterminated a species over a crime it was not capable of committing. The last confirmed wild kill was in 1930. The last captive animal died at Hobart's Beaumaris Zoo on the night of the 6th of September 1936, locked out of its shelter in weather that ran hot in the day and froze after dark. Legal protection for the species had been signed 59 days earlier, and here is the detail that matters more than any of it. 1936 is not when science determined the species was gone. It is simply the date the final captive animal stopped breathing. The Extinction Declaration came from a rule. International standard says that if 50 years pass with no confirmed sighting, a species can be classified extinct. The 50 years elapsed. In 1982, the IUCN applied the label, and Tasmania's own government followed 4 years later. Nobody ever demonstrated the thylacine was gone. A timer expired, and the paperwork updated itself. Which brings us to the reports that never stopped. Since 1910, there are more than 1,200 logged observational records from Tasmania alone. On the Australian mainland, where the species is supposed to have vanished more than 3,000 years ago, nearly 4,000 sightings have been recorded since the early 1990s. Most are explicable: dingoes at distance, spotted-tailed quolls, large feral cats in poor light, dogs with mange. But a subset comes from people whose job is identifying animals: park rangers, field biologists, veterinarians, long-serving national park staff. And their descriptions converge with unusual consistency on the same handful of features: the stiff tail held straight out, the faint banding over the hindquarters, and a stiff-legged gait that no canid on the continent reproduces. That convergence is not proof. Independent witnesses describing the same impossible animal in the same terms across 3 decades in 3 states is not evidence that it exists. But it is a pattern, and patterns require an explanation. So work the elimination the way a wildlife officer would. A dog is ruled out on tail carriage and gait alone. A thylacine's tail is rigid and thick at the base, held out behind the body, closer to how a kangaroo carries a tail than anything in the dog family. A fox is ruled out on size, on stripe placement, and on ears. A thylacine's ears sit short and rounded, low against the skull, nothing like a fox's tall points. A Tasmanian devil shares the same forest and takes longer to eliminate, but the body proportions are wrong. No devil is built long and deep-chested like that, and the feet settle it if a frame catches them cleanly. A thylacine's rear pad splits into 3 lobes. No other animal living in that forest puts down a print shaped like that, none of which has ever produced the one thing that would close the question. Let me be completely straight, because that is the whole point of this channel. In almost 90 years, not one of those sightings has produced a body. No confirmed photograph, no hair, no droppings anyone could pull DNA from, no footage that has held up once specialists looked at it properly. A $1.25 million reward offered by an Australian magazine expired in 2005 with nobody able to claim it. Every single report hits the same wall, and then, twice in the last 3 years, the ground shifted, and neither time did it come from someone with a camera in the bush. The first was in Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory, 3,000 kilometers from Tasmania. Working alongside local indigenous groups, a team led by the Griffith University archaeologist Paul Tasson documented 14 paintings of thylacines on rock walls there. Elongated dog-like animals with tapering tails, rounded ears, heavy snouts, some striped, some not. The body shape alone was apparently enough to say what it was. The smallest is about 5 inches across. The largest runs 8 feet. The mainland thylacine is supposed to have been gone for around 3,000 years. But some of these paintings were made with kaolin, a white pigment that does not survive long on rock. Tasson's assessment, published this year in Archaeology and Oceania, is that some of the images may be younger than 1,000 years old. He is careful about what that means. The artists may have been painting animals they had seen themselves, or they may have been copying much older paintings they had grown up looking at. He does not claim to know which. But there is a second number in that paper worth holding on to. Across mainland Australia, researchers have now cataloged roughly 150 rock art depictions of thylacines, against 23 of the Tasmanian devil, an animal that also vanished from the mainland. Whatever else that tells you, the thylacine was not a marginal creature in the memory of the people who lived alongside it. The second shift came from Tasmania, and it did not come from a hobbyist either. A team led by Professor Barry Brook at the University of Tasmania assembled the most rigorous analysis of the thylacine record ever attempted. 1,237 observational records from 1910 onward, each one quality rated. Sightings by experienced bushmen, professional trappers, and wildlife staff were weighted heavily. Tourist reports were weighted down. Then they modeled extinction dates probabilistically. The paper was published in Science of the Total Environment, co-authored by researchers in Australia, the UK, the United States, and France. The conclusion was not 1936. Under the fullest treatment of the record, the extinction window ran from the 1980s to the present, with a median estimated year of 1993. Brooks' own summary was that the most likely extinction dates fall between the late 1990s and the early 2000s, much later, he said, than most people would imagine. And when asked directly whether the animal could still be out there in the remote West, he put the odds at less than 1 in 10. Then he added the line that matters: it is not extraordinarily improbable, as some previous work has suggested. That is a professor at the University of Tasmania in a peer-reviewed paper saying the official extinction date may be off by nearly 60 years and putting current survival at up to 10%. Now go to Dallas. Colossal Biosciences was founded in 2021 by the Harvard geneticist George Church and the entrepreneur Ben Lamb, and the thylacine is one of its flagship projects. The science is led by Professor Andrew Pask, a Melbourne epigeneticist, who had been chipping away at the animal's genome for 2 decades before the company existed, long enough that he set up his own thylacine lab on a philanthropic grant months before Colossal came aboard. The money is not small. Colossal has raised more than $560 million. It hit a $10.2 billion valuation in January of last year, and as of July, it is reportedly in talks to raise again at somewhere between 20 and 30 billion. And what that money has bought is genuinely extraordinary. They rebuilt the thylacine genome to 99.9% complete, from DNA that had spent 90 years shattering into fragments. They pulled RNA out of a preserved thylacine head that had been sitting in ethanol for over a century, which means they can read not just the instructions, but which of them the animal's body was actually running, and where. They sequenced 11 separate individual thylacines. Then they went to work on the fat-tailed dunnart, a mouse-sized marsupial, the thylacine's closest living relative, small enough to sit in your palm, standing in for an animal the size of a large dog. They wrote more than 300 separate genetic changes into a single dunnart cell line. No animal cell had ever been rewritten that heavily. They worked out how to trigger ovulation in a marsupial to order, and they grew fertilized embryos past the halfway point of gestation in an artificial uterus, which no marsupial embryo had managed outside a mother before. Pask has stopped hedging on when. He now puts a thylacine-like animal at roughly 10 years out, with each subsequent version engineered closer to the original. So there it is. 2 roads. On one, a company with a $10 billion valuation is assembling an animal letter by letter in a laboratory and has put a date on it. On the other, a government department in Tasmania is quietly filing reports from park rangers and biologists and tourists on the Pieman River Road, describing an animal with a stiff tail and stripes down its back, and a peer-reviewed paper says the thing may have been alive as recently as the 1990s. Nobody involved in either road talks much about the other, and that is where this whole thing actually sits. Because if Brooks' numbers are right, if the extinction happened in the 90s rather than 1936, and if there is even a 1 in 10 chance of persistence today, then it is possible that hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent rebuilding an animal that never entirely left. Not likely. Possible. And nobody can currently tell you which. Here is what nobody says out loud about that. The 2 roads are not neutral toward each other. If a living thylacine were confirmed tomorrow, the de-extinction project does not become a triumph. It becomes redundant, and the animal it was building becomes a competitor to the real thing. And in the other direction, every year the lab gets closer, the incentive to look seriously for a wild population gets weaker, because why fund a search for a ghost when you can order a replacement? The honest position is uncomfortable, and it is the correct one. There is no confirmed living thylacine. There has not been one for 90 years, and the probability is low. Brooks says under 10%, and he is the person who has looked hardest. The footage that circulates is not proof, and it has never survived review. But extinct on this species was never a discovery. It was a deadline. 50 years with nothing confirmed, and a label snapped into place on a form, describing a gap in the paperwork as much as a gap in the forest. So on one side of the world, a species is being written back into existence at a cost of hundreds of millions of dollars, one edit at a time, with a timeline attached. And on the other, in the dark on a ridge in western Tasmania, in country where the road turns to a single unsealed track and closes in the wet season, something with a stiff tail and stripes down its back keeps walking past people who know exactly what they are looking at and cannot prove a thing. Neither of those stories ends with the word